Bienvenido a Café Espacial. Conduce el Dr. Fermín Romero Vázquez. Análisis con líderes expertos e influencers del futuro de la Agencia Espacial Global. Exploración espacial y potencial, extensión de la raza humana en el universo. Ámbitos más prometedores del sector espacial y sus protagonistas en gobierno, industria y servicio, academia y ONGs. Beneficios de la ciencia y tecnología espacial para toda la sociedad. Desde tierra firme, es momento de un café. Café Espacial.
Hola, ¿qué tal amigos? Buenas tardes, nuevamente viernes de Café Espacial. Aquí estamos pues ya con un nuevo invitado, inaugurando una nueva etapa con el doctor Peter Martínez. Él es nuestro primer invitado especial anglófono con el que vamos a hacer esta entrevista y esta charla en inglés. Brevemente lo introduciré en español y después me moveré al idioma inglés. Él es el primero de muchos otros expertos en los temas espaciales, que pues lamentablemente no tienen un acercamiento con nuestra lengua, pero que están muy interesados en aportar y sumar a los hispanohablantes, y yo por eso le doy la más cordial bienvenida a Peter. Brevemente les diré que Peter Martínez es doctorado en astronomía por la Universidad de Cape Town, en Sudáfrica. Es director ejecutivo de la Fundación Mundo Seguro y tiene una extensa experiencia en diplomacia espacial multilateral, así como en la formulación de diplomacia espacial y política espacial, regulación espacial. También tiene una gran experiencia en la creación de capacidades en ciencia y tecnología para el desarrollo. De 2011 a 2018, él presidió el subcomité, la COPUOS, que es la Comisión de las Naciones Unidas sobre el Uso Pacífico del Espacio Extraterrestre, así como el Working Group de sostenibilidad a largo plazo de las actividades en el espacio, y así como la negociación y el consenso de las líneas directrices para promover la seguridad y la sostenibilidad en el espacio, en las operaciones espaciales. También es miembro de la Academia Internacional de Astronáutica, del Instituto de Derecho Espacial, de la Royal Astronomical Society, y profesor honorario de la Universidad de Cape Town, así como autor de múltiples publicaciones en tópicos del espacio, sobre todo en sostenibilidad espacial, astronomía, investigación espacial, derecho espacial y política espacial. Bueno, pues ahora con su permiso me muevo al idioma inglés y le damos la más cordial bienvenida a Peter. Hi Peter, this is Fermín Romero. Thank you for having you. Long time ago we haven't seen you. Very often we met at Vienna at the Corpus meetings and in the United Nations venue. But this time I'm very pleased to have you here in Café Espacial. I'm going to introduce you very briefly, and then we move to the talk. Thanks to be with us. Peter Martinez is a PhD in astronomy has a PhD in astronomy from the University of Cape Town. He's executive director of the Secure Growth Foundation. He has an extensive experience in multilateral space diplomacy, space policy formulation, and space regulation. He also has an extensive experience in capacity building in space science and technology, and in workforce development. From 2011 to 2018, he chaired the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, the UN COPUOS, working group on the long-term sustainability of outer space activities that negotiated a set of international consensus guidelines to promote the safety and sustainability of space operations. National Academy of Astronautics, the International Institute of Space Law, a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, and an honorary professor of the University of Cape Town. He has authored or co-authored over 200 publics in space policy, space sustainability, astronomy, space research, space law, and space policy. Dear Peter Martinez, welcome to this Café Espacial.
Thank you very much, Fermin. It's a great pleasure for me to appear with you on the Café Espacial and for us to work together again. I remember very well our past experiences of working together in UN Corpus when you were part of the Mexican delegation that was so prominently involved in the negotiations of the guidelines that I will be discussing today. So it's a great pleasure, and I'm really honored to be on your show today. And also thank you for allowing me to do this interview in in English, because for me I have my whole career has been in the English language, so for me it's easier to use the terminology that that I will use in English. So thank you for this flexibility.
No problem, dear friend. Well, dear Peter, you know we're an experienced person in the space field, so please share with us your experience at Corpus, where you led the working group on long-term sustainability, LTS, of other space activities for almost 10 years. Please tell us how was it for you, and what are the most important outputs for this?
Yes. Well, you know, the idea that that the space environment is endless and that we can carry out our activities is something that people have come to take for granted. You know, we are so used to all the benefits of space activities in our daily lives that most people are really unaware that all these satellites that are sending us information and services that we rely on are actually operating in quite a fragile environment. And so the UN has been concerned with space activities from the earliest days of the space age because, as you can imagine, any kind of space activity is by its very nature an international activity. And so the UN set up already in the early days of the space age a committee to deal with these questions of space activities, particularly international collaboration in space and also the peaceful uses of outer space. And this committee over the years has been the leading international forum to discuss questions of cooperation in the peaceful uses of outer space. And it has also been the leading body for creating international space law. Now, in the early 2000s, it became increasingly clear to many of the space nations that the space environment was becoming increasingly congested with a lot of non-functional satellites, upper stages of rockets, and other things that were not delivering any useful services to people on the ground. And so the UN started to discuss the questions of how to address these problems. And by 2010, the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space decided to set up a working group to address these questions in a holistic manner. And I had the honor to be selected as the chairman of that process. We began in 2010 with a general discussion of the issue. And I must admit that in the first few years, it took some time to for all the member states to understand that this was really a concern of the whole world and not just a concern of a few leading space nations. Partly it had to do with a misperception of the importance of space for all countries, but also partly and understandably it had to do with a bit of a suspicion on the part of developing countries that this was an issue, a problem that had been created by the leading space nations, and that they should solve the problem and not use these environmental concerns to raise barriers to participation for other countries. So this was the context within which this discussion in the UN began. And it took a while for countries to realize that this was a common global concern and this, that it needed the attention of all the nations. We then began a discussion of the process, and we established a number of working groups, including one that was chaired by Mexico, or co-chaired by Mexico, that dealt with the connection between the Earth's environment and the space environment. And so that was the context within which we began these discussions of space sustainability and corpus. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about the content of the guidelines and so on.
Yes, well, what we know that there are 21 guidelines which are very important in the different fields of the space activities. And what, in your view, what are the most important, or which are the most who has most potential in the current situation of the space sustainability, the space awareness? What do you think are the best or the better guidelines?
Well, there are 21 of these guidelines, and quite apart from the fact that the UN was able to agree on these, I think that the most important benefit of this process is that we now have a shared understanding among the all of the member states of this committee of the importance of space sustainability and the idea that this is an issue of common global concern. The guidelines are grouped into 4 categories. The first is deals with policy and regulatory matters. So these guidelines address the need to set up national regulatory frameworks for space activities to govern space activities, and also the importance of states authorizing and supervising space activities so that we don't have a situation where anyone can just do anything they want in space without the supervision of a national government. The second lot of guidelines deals with the safety of space operations. And these are guidelines that deal with very practical matters, such as providing updated contact information of satellite operators, or improving the accuracy of information that is available on the orbits of satellites, or even space debris objects. There are also guidelines that deal with the sharing of information for safety, such as space weather information and so on. And then there are some guidelines that deal with international cooperation to promote space sustainability. So the guidelines all deal with different facets of space sustainability, and it is if you want to single out guidelines that are particularly important, I would say they are all important in one way or another, and many countries are beginning to implement these guidelines in their national regulatory and space governance frameworks to the extent that they can.
Yes, yeah. Well, when you finish this work at the UN Corpus, you moved to the Secure World Foundation, and then over there you organize or you work for the 2019 Secure World Foundation Summit for the Space Sustainability. What can you tell us about this important summit in Washington?
Well, this summit was an opportunity to bring together stakeholders from many different disciplines that have some kind of connection with the topic of space sustainability. So we brought together government officials, senior personalities from industry, from academia, and so on, and from the military as well, to discuss the various facets of space sustainability. The discussions were wide-ranging, and I think provided a very good opportunity for American audiences to sort of gain an international perspective on how some of these questions are perceived by their international colleagues and vice versa. The summit was very fruitful. The discussions were very fruitful. We then organized a subsequent summit in 2020, but because of COVID, that was a virtual event. Nevertheless, those discussions were also very informative, very productive. And we also had, during that summit, we had interesting developments, such as the announcement by the NASA administrator, Bridenstine, about the request for proposals for the procurement of lunar regolith. That was something that came out contemporaneously with our summit. We are again planning to hold a summit this year in the June timeframe, and we again hope to have stimulating discussions on a number of topics that are pertinent to space sustainability. Ultimately, our vision is to take the summit internationally, to have it hosted in different parts of the world so that it can benefit from different perspectives on topics of space sustainability in different regions. But of course, that will have to wait for after COVID, when we can all travel again.
We are going to move to a short break for some messages from our sponsors. But in the second block, we're going to talk about a little bit more on this. Okay, dear friends, we are now again with Dr. Peter Martinez, and in this second block we are going to talk about the legal status of the long-term sustainability guidelines. So please, Peter, tell us what is the current legal status of these guidelines for the space activities?
Thank you for that question. So these international guidelines are voluntary and non-binding, but non-binding does not mean that they are non-legal, in the sense that states can choose to take these international guidelines and implement them in their own national law, therefore giving them legal character within their jurisdictions. And indeed, some countries have chosen to do this. We had, before these guidelines, there were other United Nations guidelines on, for example, space debris. And a number of countries have incorporated elements of those international guidelines into their domestic legislation. And so thus imposing legal requirements concerning space debris mitigation on applications for licensing of space activities carried out in their jurisdictions. Also, I should say that these guidelines can help to bring about norms of behavior of how space activities are carried out. And in other words, these guidelines can help to create the customary practice of states. And after some time, if states all implement or behave in a certain fashion because they believe that that is the right thing to do, and that is what is expected by other states, this customary practice begins to acquire some weight, legally speaking, and customary practice is indeed one of the sources of international law.
Good. And compared with other legal instruments, like for example, another who had not good luck, or like the International Code of Conduct, or the ballistic missile and guidelines for it was the technology control regime, missile control regime. What are the expectations for these LTS guidelines?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the differences between this process of the LTS guidelines and the other instruments that you discussed is there was some of those instruments had a disarmament dimension, which immediately makes them more politically sensitive. Also, in the case of some of the instruments, they were very much political top-down, whereas the LTS guidelines are bottom-up, are using a bottom-up approach. And the difference is that if you have a bottom-up, technically based approach, where the experts from different countries come together and agree on common problems, common approaches that are technically sound, it is then, I think, harder for there to be some kind of political disagreement or adjustment of these technically recommended measures, which after all are to promote improved safety of space operations. So I think that is the main difference. If you talk about other instruments like the previous efforts to establish an international code of conduct for space activities, that was more of a political top-down approach with a significant disarmament element to it. And I think the problem there is that there are very different views among different countries as to which kinds of instruments are appropriate for dealing with questions of space security. There are some countries that have the view that these should be legally binding instruments, not voluntary instruments like the guidelines. And indeed, you can imagine that if you are dealing with questions of security, where any kind of agreement that needs a verification mechanism, then probably you would be better served by having a legally binding agreement. But for situations where you're dealing more with questions of safety and responsible practice, that perhaps non-binding instruments may be more flexible, faster and easier to negotiate, and more appropriate in such circumstances. And this is the kind of the category that the LTS guidelines falls into.
Yes, well, with increasing democratization of the space, it comes a responsibility and need to keep a space sustainable. And the LTS guidelines are important to the broader space community. Do you think so?
Absolutely. Although the guidelines are a product of a United Nations process and therefore aimed at states, because after all, the UN is an intergovernmental organization and its members are the states. Nonetheless, the principal actors in space activities are, private companies, space agencies, universities. And so the guidelines will only achieve their intended outcome if they are absorbed, if they are internalized, and if they are implemented to the widest extent possible. And this means not just to be, on the desk of national regulators, but really implemented in the most, in the widest way by all space actors. So we are encouraging states to disseminate wide awareness of these guidelines to their national space communities. And at Secure World, we have also taken a number of measures to promote wider awareness of these guidelines to non-state space actors. And I should say, I'm very happy to see that the space industry has taken note of this, and a number of industry-led initiatives have made reference to the LTS guidelines and encouraged their members to familiarize themselves with and to implement these guidelines to the best of their ability. One such initiative is called the Space Safety Coalition, which was established a few years ago and which contains a number of non-state space actors that are actively promoting adherence to these guidelines. And there are other industry actors as well, individual companies that are taking great steps to implement these guidelines.
That is a good news to know that the industry is thinking in a sustainable environment. That's good, Peter. I'm very happy to hear that from you. Talking about the new spacefarings, how do they receive these LTS guidelines? Do you know? How do they react or to think on this?
Yeah. Well, I think spacefaring, the emerging spacefaring nations are appreciative of these guidelines because they provide a valuable framework for them to organize their space activities. I think one of the big positive outcomes of our discussions in Corpus was for member states to realize that countries that are entering space now do not have the same luxury that the early space actors had 50 years ago in the beginning of the space age, when you could make lots of mistakes and learn from your mistakes and so on. Of course, making mistakes in space activities is very expensive, but also it raises concerns about space sustainability. So I think that this common awareness that the space environment is fragile has meant that there is now more clear guidance about how you should set up space activities in a sustainable way, but also a greater understanding that the experienced space actors have a responsibility to share their acquired experience in the safe conduct of space activities with emerging space actors, so that they don't have to make the same mistakes and learn the same lessons that were learned 50 years ago. So this is a benefit to everybody.
Yeah, I think so. We will move to another brief pause, but we will come back again.
Evita el exceso.
Well, I've seen people dancing, I'm sure I could join in. I don't know if I want to, and no one to do it with. I've seen you love everything I say, I like it when I don't have to try. Caricatures of you playing the fool always seems to fill the mind's eye. My heavy heart might weigh me down, but it stops sinking when you're around. When you talk, I'll talk the talk you talk.
Okay, we are again with Dr. Peter Martinez, and in this third block, we are talk about very briefly this is a very important report that the Secure World Foundation produces every year, and it has been during the last years an important document, and I'm talking about the 2024 Global Control Space Capabilities and Open Source Assessment. What can you tell us about this, dear Peter?
Thank you for the question. So we were inspired to produce this document by what we saw as a concerning proliferation of counter space activities. So let me explain what I mean. As more countries become critically reliant on space for their national security and defense, you can imagine that those countries will take steps to protect their space assets from possible disruption or denial or potentially even destruction by adversaries in times of conflict. And so countries are developing the technological means to be able to defend and protect their space assets. Of course, what this does raise concerns for the potential for future conflict in space. And because so many of these activities are carried out in secret, it is difficult to have conversations where everybody has accurate information. And so what we decided to do at Secure World is to begin to compile a set of information from open sources on the development of these counter space activities, and to make them available so that countries could have a discussion about these questions on the basis of the best publicly available information. And that was the origin of our counter space document. The first edition came out, I think it was 3 years ago. Each edition has been growing in size, in length, as we get more information, but also as more countries become active developers of these kinds of counter space capabilities. So we launched our 2021 report just a month ago, and we have already had a number of countries telling us that they find the information very useful in terms of their ability to engage in these discussions in an informed manner. The report's executive summary will be made available in the other official languages of the UN. And Fermin, I believe that you were involved in the translation of the executive summary.
Yes, it is. Indeed.
Thank you
Yeah.
for your contribution to this. But all of these documents...
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. And these documents are available on our website, and the translations soon will be.
Yeah, well, in the interest of the Latin American countries, in particular Mexico, so what can we learn from countries like India or even China, because they are not the typical or the classic spacefaring nations? What do you think we can learn? For example, last week I gave a conference on the national security and the space development, and we saw that that it is very important and space development to protect the national interests. So it is important for countries like Mexico to move and see a little bit on the space capacities. What do you think on this?
Certainly, I think space is becoming embedded in so many ways in modern society that no country can nowadays, I think, ignore the space dimension for national prosperity or security or development. So in this way, I think this is something that all nations have a common interest in space and in preserving the space environment. I think we will continue to see uses of space, not only for societal development, but also for security purposes. And what I think is important is that countries begin to develop clear rules of behavior, norms of behavior. We want to have a space environment where we have the rule of law, where it is a stable, predictable, and safe environment. And the way to get there is to have agreed norms of behavior, an agreed common vision for space. And the best way to do this is by international discussion and dialogue. And this is why bodies like UN Corpus and many other fora, both governmental and non-governmental, are important.
Yeah, I agree with you. My question is because, for example, countries like France, like Japan, like India, normally they not are in an offensive activities in space, but currently they are currently moving to that phase. But in the case of Latin American countries, they just are not thinking in that, and I think the military must at least look at these activities because they are important for the national security.
Well, of course, certainly taking measures to protect one's space assets is something that every country should look at. But you know, those measures can be through redundancy or other means. I think that the development of kinetic counter-space weapons is a very worrying trend, particularly if there are tests of such weapons that produce debris in orbit. And I really hope that the international space community realizes that this is a development that we should not, hopefully more countries will not move in this direction, and it should be something that should be discouraged. And I believe that as the commercial sector becomes more active in space activities, as there are more commercial satellites, that we will see the commercial sector taking a stronger position on the development or the testing of kinetic counter-space weapons that generate debris. So yes, this is a trend that we hope that we will not see reproduced in other countries, in other regions, and perhaps, you know, the Latin American region could take a lead in moving the world away from what is currently a worrying trend in the development of such types of counter-space capabilities.
Yes, originally Latin American region is a peaceful area protect from nuclear weapons, for example. But in these capacities, I think it is important to look at the other countries only to know how to protect the assets, the national assets of every country. So that's the only way I think, or I see the countries in Latin America.
Yes, and I remember very well when we were discussing the LTS guidelines, the Latin American countries really took a leading position in the preserving outer space for peaceful purposes. Yeah. And I think that this is becoming more important now than ever.
Yeah, that's right.
Given the growing uses of space and the growing societal reliance on space.
Yeah. Okay, my dear friend, well, we're the last minutes of this great conversations. So you have at least 3 or 5 minutes to tell us what is the future of the clean or sustainable environment in space regarding the new capacities, not only from governments, because the enterprises industry is very they are moving very fast to the space. So what do you think it is at this moment, what is the potential risk for space security?
I think that what we're seeing is a number of trends where you know, we have a rapidly increasing diversity, number and diversity of space actors entering the space domain. We have new kinds of space activities that were not foreseen 20 or 30 years ago, such as, you know, on-orbit servicing or refueling or life extension of satellites, or even indeed perhaps even manufacturing of objects in space. We also have emerging private sector that is really moving very, very quickly. And all of these trends have enormous potential for societal benefit on Earth, but they also raise a number of concerns. However, I think that if we as the global space community can manage these developments in a positive way through fora like Corpus, the UN, and other governmental and non-governmental fora, we can indeed avoid a situation where the space environment becomes too heavily polluted and unusable in certain orbits. We can avoid a situation of conflict in space. And as I said before, the beginning is for all the space actors to come together and for us all to develop a common vision for space, where we as humanity want to go as far as our space activities are concerned, what kind of future we want, and then to develop this common vision supported by common rules, so that we have a rule of law in space, and space becomes a safe, predictable, and sustainable domain that all actors can have access to and the freedom to use, and that results in benefits to Earth and all of its peoples.
Good. So do you think these LTS guidelines will have a follow-up from UN Corpus, or even for the countries, for example, in to protect the space?
So we are now, having negotiated these 21 guidelines, we are now in the implementation phase, and a number of countries are starting to implement the guidelines and are reporting their implementation experiences. These reports of national implementation experiences are very valuable because the guidelines are complex, and so states are all interested to see, you know, how other states are implementing given guidelines. Also, Corpus has realized that it has just begun to address the whole space sustainability issue, and so as part of adopting these 21 guidelines, Corpus agreed to have a next phase of the discussions. So as this interview is being carried out in Vienna, in parallel, the Corpus is having its annual session of its scientific and technical subcommittee, and it is putting in place already the next working group that will discuss the next phase of LTS within Corpus. And so we hope that number of the matters that were left open and unresolved in the first working group discussions in the first phase of LTS, that those will be addressed by this next working group together with other emerging issues. And of course, that the working group, this new LTS working group, will also look at the progress of implementation of the already agreed guidelines and see what lessons can be learned, and if necessary, perhaps recommend some adjustments to the already adopted guidelines as well in light of implementation experience.
It is good to hear that there will be a follow-up, and there will be a new or new phase open to the governments to review the possibilities of the guidelines. That is a good news for the whole planet, because the space environment is very important. A clean space environment is very important, not only from in the field of space security, because as you mentioned, also the space debris is important. So it is good to hear that good news. Well, my friend, for me it was a pleasure to hear you, to share a little bit the information you manage deal daily with in your office with the Secure World Foundation, and your experience during your work at Corpus. So great job you are done in the last years. So thank you very much to share this information with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation to have this conversation with you. I really enjoyed it, and look forward to further interactions in future.
Yes, of course. It is the first of, I hope, many others. It's good to hear you, and I send you a hug, my friend.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.